Hello, everyone. Welcome to EROSS 2020, the ER Online Summer Seminars. This is a series of talks with world-class researchers in the area of conceptual modeling, but also adjacent areas like knowledge representation, ontology, logics, cognitive science, and so on. I'm Giancarlo Guizzardi, and I'm organizing this together with Enrico Franconi, Thiago Salles, and Claudine Moraes. EROSS is an event connected to the Bolzano Summer of Knowledge, and also to this 4 decades tradition of the International Conference on Conceptual Modeling. So the Bolzano Summer of Knowledge will happen online next month, so please check their website. And ER, the International Conference on Conceptual Modeling, will also happen online in November, so please check the ER website for details. Without concepts, there can be no thoughts, and without analogies, there can be no concepts. So this is actually a quote from a book called Surface and Essence, written by Douglas Hofstadter and Emmanuel Sander, a book about analogy. And I think it's a perfect way to present our guest of today and this talk. She actually explicitly said she thinks this should be the motto of AI. Our guest of today is Melanie Mitchell. She's a Davis Professor of Complexity at the Santa Fe Institute and a Professor of Computer Science currently on leave at the Portland State University. She has made seminal contributions to the topics of conceptual abstraction and analogical reasoning, but also complex systems, genetic algorithms, and cellular automata, and visual recognition in artificial intelligence. She's been working with conceptual abstraction and analogical reasoning for more than 3 decades, since her PhD, which she did under the supervision of Douglas Hofstadter and also John Holland, the creator of genetic algorithms, in which she proposed the now famous Copycat Cognitive Architecture. She has also made a very important contribution to the education and popularization of these topics. This include offering online courses, including her massively popular course on Introduction to Complexity, which has been taken by thousands of people, to giving interviews and writing divulgation articles in top news outlets such as El País, the New York Times, and Wired magazine. She's the author of 6 books, including Analogy Making and Perception, a computer model, that was published by MIT Press in '93, an Introduction to Genetic Algorithms, which is an extremely well-known book in the area. By itself, it has almost 16,000 citations. And my 2 personal favorites, which are Complexity, Guided Tour, which won the Phi Beta Kappa Science Book Award and was named by Amazon one of the 10 best science book of 2009. And last year, she published this marvelous book called Artificial Intelligence, A Guide for Thinking Humans, in which she discussed with depth, but also in a really accessible way, the limitations and risks of the current trends on AI, and the need for people doing research in AI for paying more attention to embodied cognition, common sense knowledge, as well as human-like abilities for abstraction and analogy making. So I'm really delighted to have her here to talk about conceptual abstraction and analogies. So I'm very happy to have you here, Melanie. Welcome to EROSS.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here. And thanks to everybody for tuning in to this talk. So back in 1955, probably at least some of you are familiar with the work of John McCarthy and Minsky et al. On proposing this summer research project on artificial intelligence, which really kicked off the field. And they proposed that, sorry, I'm trying to make the slides go. Yeah, so here's what they proposed for the field of AI. An attempt will be made to find out how to make machines use language, form abstractions and concepts and solve problems now reserved for humans, etc. So this idea of forming abstractions and concepts was really a key goal, even from the beginning of AI. But it's one of the areas that AI, I would say, has perhaps had the least success in. So we all know that in the last decade, the idea of deep neural networks has really revolutionized the field of AI. This is a picture of a deep neural network in which we have an input with a photo here that goes through many, many different layers of simulated neurons. And finally, at the output, guesses or predicts what the photo contains. Here, the boat is the highest confidence. And this is modeled through the visual system in the brain, in which an image comes in, is projected through the brain back to the visual cortex at the back of the brain. And the visual cortex is constructed of a hierarchical set of layers of neurons through which information propagates. And you can see that these layers in the deep neural network are really meant to model these layers inspired by, I would say, the layers in the visual cortex. So deep neural networks learn to mimic the brain in a very rough sense, in that the information that's processed starts out here, for instance, as edges going through simple shapes to more complex shapes to representations of faces and objects. And this approach not only works for vision, but has also been shown to work in language and game playing and all kinds of different applications in AI. And the most famous application perhaps has been this object recognition challenge called ImageNet, which has millions of images that have been labeled by humans. Every year, starting in 2009, there's been a competition. This shows a plot of the error rate of the best programs entered in this competition. You can see the error rate going down, 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 down until the final competition. And ever since 2012, the best programs have all been deep neural networks of deeper and deeper neural networks, meaning more and more layers between the input and the output. And human performance has been roughly measured at about 5% error rate, and you can see that the best neural networks are surpassing humans on this particular benchmark. So this has led to a lot of claims in the press, such that computers are now better than humans at recognizing and sorting images, or that they can even caption images almost as well as humans. In the area of natural language, AI can read documents and answer questions as well as a person. This is from the Microsoft AI blog. We've all seen predictions about self-driving cars that starting in 2020, which is now, of course, that we'll start to see millions of cars be completely autonomously driving around. And, you know, all of these things haven't really happened the way that people had hoped. And one of the problems is that it's not always the case that these machines are learning what we intended them to learn, what we humans see in the data. So here's an example from my own research group. One of my graduate students did a project where he trained a deep neural network to recognize whether an image had an animal in it or no animal. So in the image on the left, you see there's an animal, and on the image on the right, a landscape, no animal. So that there was a large data set of National Geographic nature photos, and his deep neural network was able to do very well at this task. But then when he dug deep into what the neural network had actually learned, he found that the neural network was in part recognizing that this images with animals tended to have a blurry background, whereas images with no animals had a very clear background, because of course the photographer here is focusing on the animal, whereas here there's nothing to focus on in the foreground. And so part of what the network had learned was to distinguish images with blurry backgrounds from images with clear backgrounds, rather than actually recognizing animals. So that was a little bit disturbing. And in recent years, a lot of people have been showing this kind of phenomenon with neural networks, with deep neural networks. For instance, a deep neural network that was trained on this ImageNet data set was able to recognize fire trucks with 99% confidence, okay? But if you Photoshop the fire truck into strange poses, the network now thinks that this is a school bus or a fireboat or a bobsled. So somehow the neural networks are learning features that allow them to do very accurate prediction for images that have certain characteristics, but they're not really seeing the same thing that we humans see in these images. They're not using the same features to make their decisions. We can see this also with image captioning programs that learn how to take an image and output a sentence about the image. So this is an example where the network very accurately describes the image, but we also see these kinds of networks can make very strange descriptions, such as this one, a young boy holding a baseball bat, a woman holding a teddy bear in front of a mirror. I like this one, a horse is standing in the middle of the road. It looks like a wet kind of desert western scene where a horse should be standing in the middle of the road, but of course there's no horse there. So the machine has somehow associated features in this image with horses. So all of these things show that the machines are not necessarily learning the concepts that we intended to teach them. Many of you will be familiar with the work of Google DeepMind on video games, for example. They also were the ones who created the machine AlphaGo that was able to beat the best Go players. This is a game called Breakout, a video game that a person moves a paddle, this little red rectangle, to hit a ball to collide with bricks, that these colored lines, and destroy bricks. And the machine used a technique called deep Q learning with a deep neural network to learn to play this game just by watching videos and taking actions. And the machine learned to play at over 1,000% of human level performance, so it's surpassing humans by a huge amount. But another group showed that that same algorithm that learned, that same network that learned to play this breakout game, if the paddle was shifted up by a few pixels, the machine no longer could play. It no longer could do well at all. Whereas a human would be able to adapt to this small change. The machine really hadn't come up with the same concepts that humans come up with, like the concept of a paddle or the concept of a ball. It was seeing some kind of correlation in the pixels of the video that allowed it to play very well in this situation, but wasn't able to transfer what it had learned to this rather similar situation. Another example is that people have found that self-driving cars, the most common accidents that they're involved in are when people rear-end them. And what that means is the car sees something that it thinks is an obstacle, slams on its brakes, but no human would consider whatever it saw an obstacle. So the human's not expecting it to slam on its brakes, and the human crashes into it. And these machines have problems with their visual systems, with their cameras, in determining exactly what should be an obstacle or not for a car. And even more concerning, these systems are vulnerable to attacks where, for instance, in this example, certain carefully placed stickers on stop signs make the car think that the sign is actually a speed limit 80 sign. So this is called an adversarial attack. So these machines are somehow perceiving the world in a very different way that we humans do. And the way that I think of it is that they're perceiving perceptual categories instead of concepts. So that's what we humans perceive. So what do I mean by that? Well, you can see here that there's all kinds of these categories like bird, boat, cat, dog, but they're not the same as a concept of those things. Those words to us mean something much richer than what they mean to these machines. So think about the concept of a bridge. You might be able to train a deep neural network to recognize all these different examples as bridges, but the concept of a bridge in the human mind is something much deeper. For instance, here's an example of what's called a water bridge. So this is a bridge over a highway. You can see the highway down below, and the bridge of water is over the highway for boats to cross the highway. So that's a very non-standard kind of bridge that wouldn't fit into the perceptual category of the neural network. But we humans can understand it because we understand its function. Similarly, we see things like bridges that ants build with their bodies to cross from one surface to a surface separated by a gap. We can do things like bridge our hands. We talk about the bridge of the nose, the bridge of a song, bridging the gender gap. We have this very rich set of ideas about what bridges are that allow us to make these very abstract extensions of the concept. And, you know, our presidential candidate, Joe Biden, has many times said that he's a bridge to a new generation of leaders. And we understand that. We understand exactly what he means by that. And there's all kinds of other examples, you know, of very abstract notions of the notion of bridge. And this is just one example. Most human concepts can be extended in this way, by creating these very abstract versions that we are able to make sense of immediately. I heard somebody on the radio the other day say, that's like building a bridge while you're walking on it, as a metaphor. And I instantly understood it because I have this very rich concept of what a bridge is and what that would mean to build a bridge while walking on it. And I'm sure you can all come up with a mental image of what that would be like. So Hofstadter, in his paper, Analogies, the Core of Cognition, defined a concept as a package of analogies, which I think is a really interesting way of looking at it. And you really can see that with the idea of the bridge, that what we're doing in extending these concepts in this abstract way is making analogies. So the question for me as a AI researcher is, how do we get machines to learn concepts in this way rather than simple perceptual categories and make analogies? And I think that that's really what's needed to make these machines more robust, to make them learn the same kinds of things that we humans learn and be able to act in our world in a much more robust way. So the rest of this talk, I'm going to be talking about some ways in which people are approaching this question of concepts and analogy. And most people look at this, the way that they do research is by defining some abstract idealized domains. So I'm going to look at several different domains that people are using to study these analogy making and concept abstraction, and then talk about some selected AI methods that people have been using. I'll just talk about three. One is how people are applying deep neural networks to this task. Another method called Bayesian rule induction. And finally, I'll talk about my own work on the so-called copycat architecture. And then end with some questions about how we can make further progress in this area. So one of the popular domains that people have been looking at are something called Raven's progressive matrices. These were actually invented many decades ago as an intelligence test for humans. So the idea here is that you have this grid that has 8 different sort of figures, and the task is to fill in what figure best fits here in this 9th slot, and you get a choice of 8 different possibilities. So you have to kind of see how things are varying, how things are changing. You know, we see that there's really 3 different shapes, that larger shapes like square, triangle, diamond, varying here, and then these are vertical, horizontal, diagonal, and they have different fillings. So we see that, you know, what's lacking here is we have to have a diagonal fill black diamond, and so we look for that here. And I'm sorry, square, not diamond, right? So we see that this is the right answer. So this has long been, you know, you can have, there's many different problems that have these, that people have been given. And it's been claimed that performance on this test is highly correlated with human intelligence, where human intelligence is defined in some way. So I'm not going to debate the merits of this as a test of human intelligence, but I wanted to tell you about this as an AI challenge because this has become a popular domain for studying artificial intelligence. Okay, a different domain that a lot of people have been interested in is the so-called Bongard problems. So Bongard problems were developed by a Russian computer scientist, Bongard, in the 60s. He published a book about it called Pattern Recognition, in which he posed these problems as a challenge for AI. The idea in each problem is that there's some set of figures on the right, I'm sorry, the left, and then some set of figures on the right, and you're supposed to say, what's the difference? Like here, the difference is large versus small. Here it's unfilled versus filled, vertical versus horizontal, right versus left. So there's many other features. So the task is really to figure out what features are relevant and what features are not relevant to come up with sort of the concept that's being represented here. And some of them are more challenging. So here you might say that these figures here on the left have a neck. You know, they have this indentation, which we might call a neck. These don't have a neck, but that's kind of a concept that maybe you haven't really ever applied to a figure before. So you have to come up with sort of new concepts on the fly. Here we have horizontal neck versus vertical neck, twins versus, or same versus different. This one people easily see as, you know, outside versus inside, even though there's no sort of solidly connected figure in any of these. This is a very abstract representation of 3 versus 4. And all of these problems are fairly, you know, doable for humans. Humans, they're a little bit challenging for humans, but nobody's ever got a machine to solve these problems, even though they just consist of very relatively simple line drawings. So these are an open challenge. Finally, Hofstadter and I worked on these letter string analogies as a way to approach abstraction and analogy making, where we try and idealize analogy making in these very simple letter string, we call them situations. So here's one situation, ABC, and it changes to a new situation, ABD. Do the analogous change to this third situation, PQRS? And most people will say PQRT, you know, because, okay, the successor in the alphabet. But of course, other answers are possible, such as PQRD, change the rightmost letter to a D, or leave it alone, PQRS, because you might say, oh, all C's change to D's, but there's no C's here, or even change any string to ABD. So the answer here is ABD. So there's analogies that range from more literal to more abstract. And the question is, how do humans agree usually on what's the sort of best answer in these simple problems? And you can think of that in AI, we would call this a one-shot learning problem, where I'm giving you one example. So this is like one training example. And now you have to do the same thing to this new example. Well, deep learning, of course, needs millions of examples. So this would be a very challenging problem. And you can get more abstract versions of this, where we now want to change a group rather than a single letter, or reversals. There's all kinds of different analogies that you can try and express in this domain. And the idea is, here we have these idealized situations that have objects, relations, groups, actions, events, and so on. So we weren't interested in letter string analogies per se, but more as a tool for exploring general issues of abstraction and analogy. So now that I've told you about these different idealized domains, let me talk about some of the methods that have been applied. So I'll talk about these three different methods. So deep neural networks, of course, deep neural networks have been used extensively in vision, language, robotics, game playing, but not so much for these abstraction kinds of problems. So several groups have tried to look at these Raven's progressive matrices with neural networks. So this group from 2020 proposed to do it this way. Well, where the input to the neural network is going to be 16 images. So there's 8 in the initial matrix and 8 possible answers. And then train a kind of neural network, actually one that has many more layers than this. They were using ones with 50 to 100 layers. And then the answer comes about as a probability distribution over the 8 possible responses here. Okay, and so the one with the highest probability is considered to be the answer. And the idea was to just train this neural network to do these problems. Well, as I said, to train a neural network, you need many, many training examples. So how do you get that? Well, they used 42,000 training examples and then tested it on 14,000. Where did they get all these? Well, they had to come up with an automated way to generate them. So this group came up with this idea of what they call the stochastic image grammar, where they would have sort of a general schema for what the problem would be. Is it going to have a structure of inside, outside? They had some number of different structures, and for each structure, they said what's the outside, what's the inside, what kind of layout does it have, what are the shapes, what number of things are there, and each of these would be sampled from this grammar to create a new problem. And so you're able to sample endlessly to create all, tens of thousands of example Raven's problems. And the results were very impressive. Okay, so some of these neural networks, just look at these are all different approaches, were able to get an average accuracy, that is fraction of correct answers, that were higher than what the humans they tested were able to get. So here's another example of neural networks surpassing humans. But not so fast. This really shows some of the problems with trying to figure out how neural networks actually solve a problem. It has some limitations. It requires this very large corpus of examples that need to be automatically generated. And the trained networks are not very transparent. Again, the question, what did they actually learn? And it turns out that another group found that there was a bias in this training set, in this set of problems, because the way that the answers were generated, the possible answers, was to have one correct answer and then to make a change in one feature of that correct answer, like shape, color, number, etc. And the result was that among the answer set, there was actually a way to cheat to find the answer without having to actually solve the problem, because you could just take along each feature, like shape, color, number, etc. You could take the majority among all of the answers. So the majority of the answers have the shape here of pentagon, a majority have sort of dark, a majority have large, and some other features. And so this other group found that if you only train on the answers and don't even look at the problem, you were able to do just as well as the original. So this is, again, the problem of what are these neural networks actually learning to do? They learn to solve problems however they can, depending on what statistics are in the data. And they're not very transparent. So it's not really clear how to make sure that your data set doesn't have these kinds of biases. Okay, let me talk about a different problem. Sorry. This other group in 2018 used a very different approach than neural networks. They used something called Bayesian rule induction to solve Bongard problems. Okay, so this approach has become a popular area in AI and machine learning, sometimes known as probabilistic programming. Here, the group defined a grammar that would be able to create rules to solve these problems. So the grammar says, you know, here's what's going to be on the left and the right, and then you can fill in, well, for instance, there exists some kind of description, and then that description is further filled out using the primitives in this grammar. So let me show you an example. Well, how this induction is done. We say that the left and the right image sets are these, and the grammar is this, G, and R is some rule in the grammar. Then what the system is going to do is it's going to use Bayes' rule to say that the probability of a rule over all possible rules, given the images and the grammar, can be factored into these two probabilities, the probability of the images given the rule times the probability of the rule given the grammar. We define this prior probability, well, the probability of the images given the rule is 1 if the images are compatible with the rule. So that's the likelihood, and then the probability, the prior probability, the probability of the rule given the grammar, we'll say is higher if R is concise. So that gives a way to kind of search through different rules, and then use these constraints to create probability distributions over the possible rules or programs, and then do a massive search and sample programs from this distribution until a compatible rule is found. So their method was able to deal with 39 out of 100 Bongard problems. Some of them it didn't have the sort of primitives in the grammar to deal with, but out of that 39, it solved 35, pretty good. But some of the problems with this approach is that you need a lot of built-in primitives, and the question is, how do you decide what primitives to put in? There's also somewhat ad hoc definition of the prior probability. How do you decide how to assign those probabilities? And of course, requires a lot of search. So it's not clear that this can scale to more complex problems. But this is an approach that a lot of people are taking and trying to refine in concept formation in AI. So finally, I want to talk about the copycat architecture, which is something that I worked on, which is a really different approach from either of the two I talked about before. It's much more focused on the cognitive science ideas of how perception takes place, not only visual perception, but perception in sort of the mind's eye, higher level perception. So here we worked on these letter string analogies. We have a concept network which gives the sort of what you might call the ontology of the domain, sort of the letters in the alphabet, their sequence, some concepts like grouping and how things can possibly change. And then the work of figuring out the analogy is done by what we call codelets, which are perceptual agents that stochastically try and consider different hypotheses and build on what one another do. I'll show you a demo of it in a minute. But they do things like hypothesize particular groupings of letters, different relationships between letters, correspondences, and these different structures that are built by these codelets can either support each other or compete with each other. And finally, there's what we call a computational temperature, which controls how stochastic, how random these perceptual agents are. And also there's a feedback where the amount of structure that is coherent goes to affect the temperature. So the more coherent the structures that are built, the lower the temperature, which means the lower the randomness. So we get this dynamics of interactive random behavior transitioning to more deterministic behavior. So I'll show you that in a movie of Copycat. This is actually a version of Copycat called Metacat, written by my colleague Jim Marshall, doing this analogy. So here you see ABC changes to CBA. What does PPQQRR change to? You can work on that. And so what you'll see here is that these different codelets or perceptual agents, let me start running it. You'll see them as these little lightning bolts trying out different hypotheses and testing whether the hypothesis has any evidence for it. And if it does, these dotted structures are built, and the dotted structures become darker and darker until they're more and more confirmed by evidence. And evidence of like this grouping puts more pressure on the system to make additional groups. So these groups support each other, and you can see the temperature getting lower and lower as the system kind of coalesces on a coherent representation of the whole analogy. And finally, it's able to say, okay, what's happened was that the direction of the string was reversed. So what we're going to do is reverse the direction of the groups here, and we get RRQQPP. So that gives kind of an idea of how this interactive, active perception works in our system. Oops. So here are some important ideas, that the perception of the analogy here is unfolding dynamically, meaning there's this feedback going on. So things are happening over time, which is not the case in like a neural network. It's completely feed forward. And we're integrating top-down and bottom-up processes. And the idea here is that we're building representations. The system itself is building a representation of its input. At the same time, it's trying to make this analogical mapping and integrating prior knowledge with bottom-up perceptions. And as the system goes on and builds, say, a group, that perceived context puts pressure on the system to build additional groups or things that fit in that context. And so there's this emergent transition from this more bottom-up, parallel, random exploration to more of a top-down, more serial, more deterministic mode of processing. But Copycat, of course, has its own limitations. Its architecture is, it's not very, it's not like a Bayesian approach. It's a little more ad hoc. It's not clear how general the architecture is. And all of the concepts in it, the concept network, is given to it by humans. It's not learned. So that's, these are some of the limitations that I think need to be overcome. So let me just mention at the end this very recent idea by Francois Chollet from Google on the so-called abstraction and reasoning corpus. He wrote this paper called On the Measure of Intelligence, which I highly recommend. It's a long but really interesting paper. And in it, he proposes, kind of like Bongard, kind of like Hofstadter, a new domain for measuring or studying abstraction called the ARC, or abstraction and reasoning corpus, where the idea here is it's sort of like Copycat, where you have one situation, which is a grid of colored squares that changes into a new situation. So take this thing and make it into this. But now we have 3 examples. Do this thing and make it into this. Do this thing and make it into this. And you sort of see this, there's sort of a pattern here where the colors are arrayed sort of more or less vertically. And so you show that representation here. Here they're arrayed more or less horizontally. And now do the same thing here. This is the task, this test grid. Okay, so Chollet developed a whole set of hundreds of these problems. There's a lot of them are really clever. You can look at them online. This one's kind of like a one thing on top versus the other thing on top. So, you know, it gets into this idea of not just two-dimensional. So he developed 1,000 actually of these so-called tasks. And he published the training set, but not the evaluation set, and made it into a Kaggle challenge. So Kaggle's this website where people propose these machine learning challenges, and you can win a lot of money by solving these problems. Well, this bunch of different teams participated in this, and the result was that 20% of the test cases were solved, which sounds like a lot, but Chollet told me that basically there was just a brute force algorithms of handcrafted search space. So it wasn't really anything that could be generalized very well. So this still remains open. So how do we make progress on abstraction and analogy in AI? Well, we've seen these different approaches that I outlined. There's actually quite a few others, but there's all sorts of really important questions. Should we design idealized versus real world domains? We see that sometimes with real world domains, we can't really understand exactly what the system is actually learning or what it's doing. And so it's useful to make idealized domains, but then the question is, how do you generalize? Should we make tasks multiple choice, like for the Ravens problems? Or is it better to make the system actually generate its answer, like in Copycat or in the ARC problems? How much training should we allow? You know, with these neural networks, they need tens of thousands or more examples. But does it even make sense to train extensively for a test like the Ravens problems, where the test is meant really to indicate a more general abilities? You know, humans aren't supposed to train for it, although training can help, I think. How much prior knowledge should we give? Like, what should the prior knowledge be? Elizabeth Spelke, a cognitive psychologist, has proposed that humans actually have what she called core knowledge that's really present almost from birth, that we have the knowledge of objects and object relationships. We are able to intuitively perceive spatial temporal motion. We have the notion of agentness. Something has agency and goal-directedness and some notion of numerosity. So that's one way of trying to figure out how much prior knowledge we should give, is to look to developmental psychology. And then how do we evaluate the results? Should we just look at accuracy, which actually can be misleading, or should we look more at things like robustness to, you know, perturbations like we saw with, for instance, the Breakout video game? It wasn't robust to small changes. Or scaling, you know, can the system actually scale up to more complex problems, and can it transfer its knowledge to new situations? And how do we make sure that the results on these benchmarks will teach us something about real world concepts? Okay, just as the last part of this talk, I just want to tell you a little bit about some of the work, the current work that my group is doing around these topics, trying to scale up ideas from copycat to real world, more real world like analogies. And we're doing this by looking at what we call visual situations or visual concepts. So here's a visual concept, somebody walking a dog, okay? But of course, we humans can recognize this visual situation in many different kinds of instances, you know, things where it's very hard to see things like, you know, we see this leash here, although out of context, it might be very hard to see that as a leash. We can spot the situation in a cluttered image, like, you know, we see immediately this is the guy walking the dog, and kind of ignore all these other things. Even in the with shadows and from different angles and all kinds of different clutter. So how is it that we humans are so good at recognizing not just objects, but whole situations of visual configurations? So this is the kind of approach that we're trying to do. We're using ideas from the Copycat architecture to do this, where we're taking some knowledge about a situation, like that these are the objects we're looking for and they have certain kinds of relationships to one another, and try and ground these in a specific image and give the what we call a grounding score, which is how well these bounding boxes here, these white boxes, actually capture the situation as a concept. So what we've been doing is we have a relatively small number of labeled images that look like this that humans have labeled. We have about 300 training examples. And then we have two kinds of models that are learned. One is an object appearance model using a convolutional neural network. So that's just like, does this look like a person walking a dog? Does this look like a leash? Does this look like a dog? Independent of any other object. But then we have what we call the situation model, which is how do all these boxes fit together in terms of their size, their shape, their location in the image. And we build a model, a multivariate Gaussian, over these different variables. So now we have this trained example. We use the sort of copycat-like active perception. So hopefully you can see this. This is probably a little bit hard to see, but you know, here's the dog walker. You can sort of barely see the leash and the dog. And what our system does is it starts out with these models of, this is a location probability of each object, the dog walker, dog, and leash. And these are the priors on the shape, meaning the aspect ratio of the boxes and the relative size. And so the system is able to do these kind of copycat-like codelets that sample these different, sample these different, from these different variables of location, shape, and size, and try and find a set of boxes that best fit the learned model. So you can see here, and I don't know if you can see this, but this says, this gives the grounding score here so far. It goes between 0 and 1. Here it's 0.16, very bad, because this being the dog walker and this being the dog don't fit the learned model very well. Although this looks like a human walking a dog, this looks like a dog, but together they don't fit well. So the system's really trying to get a model that will fit, and the way it does it, it's saying, like, now it's conditioned. If the leash is here and the dog is here, the dog walker really should be here and should have a smaller size. And in fact, there it finally said this is probably a better set of boxes. And it settles on this with now a 0.83 high grounding score. So we found that, if we test this, for instance, if we put a single dog walking example into a set of 5,000 images that are not examples of dog walking, and we ask for each value of n, what's the probability that our dog walking image will be scored in the top n, we find that our system, like here, this says that there's about a 65% probability that a dog walking image will be scored in the top 20. Our system was able to very dramatically outperform some other systems that we compared it with. So if you're interested, I can give you a reference to that paper. But now we're still left with the idea that human conception of dog walking, like the human conception of bridges, can get more abstract. And here's some things that our system can't deal with that I think that humans shows kind of the ability of human concepts to be very fluid. So this is a nice example of dog walking, but our system doesn't have the concept. It didn't learn from its examples about having many dogs, although a human can easily extend their, have they learned about walking one dog, they recognize this as dog walking. This is a cat being walked, not very happy, but so this is a nice analogy, but our system might not recognize that as a dog. This is a weird one of somebody walking their iguana with a leash that's part of its own body. And there's all kinds of examples of sort of non-prototypical dog walking, people on bikes, people on skateboards, dog on skateboard, person on bike, and people would say, yes, this is walking the dog. That was what it was called. People walking dogs in cars. We actually, sometimes see this. And dog walking a dog. We humans are just really good at these very sort of extending our ideas, and we could just go on and on about this. So I think that this whole idea of, as in the introduction, it was said, without concepts there are no thought, and without analogies there are no concepts. I think that's really important for thinking about conceptual modeling, conceptual concept recognition, and getting more human-like AI. So I have a recent paper in AI magazine on this idea, and my recent book talks about this in great detail. And thank you very much for listening to all this, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions.